The first presenter for today is Anne Dillabough, who is a reader in the Sociology of Youth and Global Culture at the University of Cambridge. She was formerly the David Lamb Chair in Multicultural Education in Educational Studies in UBC and an assistant professor at the University of Toronto. The respondents of Joanne's lecture are two professors from the Education faculty at the University of Iceland, Ingólfur Ásgeir Jóhannesson and Guðný Guðbjörnsdóttir, sitting here in the front row as all the respondents. Joanne is going to discuss for whom does freedom exist, gender, education, and citizenship. Welcome, Jojo. The floor is yours.
Lovely. Excuse me. Well, let me begin by thanking Berglund, Hadla, and all the people that have put this fantastic conference together. It's such incredibly hard work, and we often don't see that work. It looks like another version of invisible labor, but I'm very grateful. It's been a wonderful conference, and it's always lovely to be in Iceland, so thank you. I want to just pick up a little bit on things that were mentioned yesterday that were important, and I have to stick to time. So there's two caveats, which is I always share with people, which is sometimes I talk too quickly. So just somebody wave at me if they're going too quickly, but we have limited time, so I want to be careful to cover what I need to cover. And the other is that I want to try and clarify things so that they are clear for everyone, so I'll try and go carefully through the material. I noticed some really interesting things yesterday, which I will take home with me. Snippets or sound bites of a movement, a suffrage movement. If she can, I can. Those sorts of narratives are very important, and notions of equality also. However, one of the things that sometimes happen when we talk about equality is we miss other bits and pieces. So the idea of disaggregating some of the narratives around equality when we think about citizenship is very crucial. And what I'm going to be talking about is the ways in which what was once called education feminism changed the nature of education for women, and the ways in which different strands of feminist movements both contributed but had some limitations. And I want to present that second caveat now with the knowledge that I respect all of these movements and the struggles for trying to generate a new notion of what it means to be educated, but also to share where there might have been some gaps or challenges. Okay, so because we're in Iceland and we're celebrating this event, let me read this to you. And we heard about this yesterday, but these fantastic photos are available, and I just thought there's a moment in time where we want to ask the question that Hannah Arendt asks, for whom does freedom exist? She also says, when we talk about equality or freedom, we are only free when we are connected to others. And I think this photograph is a beautiful representation of that. And apologies to the men in the audience. I think maybe they probably did cope. You'll see this narrative, I'm sure you did, or they did, where they were. In October 24th, 1975, the women in Iceland went on strike for equal rights. 90% of women walked off their jobs and out of their homes, shutting down the entire country. The men could barely cope. Pause. The next year, Parliament passed a law guaranteeing equal pay. 5 years later, Iceland elected the world's first woman president. Now Iceland has the highest gender equality in the world. So this image is a starting point. Another photograph of the same time period, but fantastic in its numbers and collective. All right, so what I want to talk about first is a certain notion of what we mean when we talk about suffrage, because one of the things we have to think about is the notion of how the state divided up citizenship in terms of a public and a private domain. The public being the autonomous, rational actor, and the private being the domesticated, caring domain. So when we think about suffrage, one of the things that's important to argue is that we see it as a political action, people both acting and suffering as a political narrative which is constantly mobile. And in this case, one of the things I think we need to struggle to do, depending on where we are geopolitically, is to move beyond the notion of the category of the female. So when we're talking about gender equality, we're talking about women, but transgendered subjects, the LGBT plus community, the transnational and post-colonial communities, all of which I think have been raised in certain ways here, but sometimes we lose sight that the very movement of suffrage pushed the boundaries of what constituted the category gender. We also know it's a response to gender enslavement, both now and in past time. And we also understand that there's been narratives around women as domesticated and as not actors in the public sphere, what might be called benevolent philanthropy. So what does it mean when we talk about liberation or liberated struggles, liberated states or struggles for liberation? If citizenship in past time was the autonomous, rational actor, it meant that women were therefore not rational actors and excluded from citizenship. In this case, depending on where we are and in what time, one could argue that women were living in a kind of exile in the nation. Now, in the contemporary moment, we might see them as new strangers, new, in inverted commas, foreigners to citizenship, people without any sense of place, or who, as Hannah Arendt might have argued, are stateless. Who are those women? Where are they? Here we then have varied conceptions of freedom, as did many education feminists, and I want to talk through that. So, Arendt again, we are only free when we are connected to others. A very important suffrage narrative, I believe. This is an interesting photo. It's not a very good representation, but it's the emergence of socialist feminism as it was represented in public life and also in education. And at the bottom, we missed the caption. It says, "If I had a hammer, I would smash patriarchy." She finds it. And so, did we? I think we did. Again, another representation of socialist feminism, the first decade, 66, 76. Narratives of suffrage and education beyond. One of the things that's important to recognize about the varied versions of feminism that operated within education is they had different focus, a different kind of focus. And in this case, this group was affiliated with the concern around war, conflict, and solidarity. There's more to it. And there were also representations that were resisting feminism. Now, I don't know if people know about Pat Robertson, a very famous or infamous evangelical preacher on telly. Feminism is a socialist, anti-family political movement that encouraged women to leave their husbands. Oh dear, what about the women that don't have husbands or have partners or don't want husbands? They kill their children. So we are murderers, we practice witchcraft, and we destroy capitalism. It's been very happy, hasn't it, capitalism? We've all benefited a great deal from that movement, and we've become lesbians. That's terrifying. Now, this is a bit dense, and I want to be careful about time, so I'll try and talk through a little bit of each of the movements, and it's important that we see that there is variations in education feminism and its impact, and what it did, and what critics said it may have got wrong or missed. Maybe not wrong is the wrong word, or wrong phrase. So, a socialist/Marxist perspective in education. And remember, education's a very important civic realm to achieve rights for women. So it's important to consider it. So what were they concerned with? Not necessarily the language of equality, but equity, which has more of a social, the greatest good for the greatest number reference. Waged labor, women working in the sphere of education. A recognition that they were excluded from educational and labor structures and often seen as a reserve army of labor. Think of World War II, women in ammunition factories, domestic servants, sweatshops, nurses, teachers. So what do we see? Women as units of production in the labor structure and their gendered character. What did these feminists want? They wanted to end economic oppression and viewed capitalism as the culprit or force of oppression. Where was the limits? Did it challenge the gender binary, the idea that there is only two categories, men and women? Many argued Marxist struggles were very patriarchal in form, but it did seek to challenge social inequality, particularly around labor and education. Maternal feminism and the female citizen in education. Another argument, primarily from a scholar who some of you may know, Carol Gilligan, championed some of this, the idea of a caring feminism in education. Women as teachers, as mothers, as nurturers of childhood and mothers of the nation. Think early childhood education for those people who are involved in education, single-sex classrooms, etc. Where were its limits? It failed to challenge social structures. In some cases, many feminists, not within this realm, argued it reinforced the binary, the idea that that's all women could do was be caring. If we look back at history and the role of women in teaching, we find out that that may not be so, but it did acknowledge the potential for a caring feminism to operate through educational practices. Perhaps the most dominant narrative of feminism, and here I need to acknowledge work I did some years ago with a colleague called Madeleine Arnott. Where did it sit? And it's certainly a popular narrative, regardless of what the political economy of the state is telling us about neoliberalism, equality, autonomy, and this is an important word, but a problematic one sometimes, tolerance. Do we want to tolerate necessarily, or do we want to accept, integrate? Freedom. So, equal rights, liberal constitution, Mary Wollstonecraft, women as rational thinkers, hence equal. Equal was the language. Equal education and a recognition of discrimination. Where were the limitations? And I think these are very important because we're in a contemporary moment where it's difficult for us to talk about taking one step forward and two steps back, and the geopolitical context we might be in. It challenged social structures, failed to challenge some of the structures that kept women undermined, failed to confront other sorts of narratives, not always, but around race or around class, and particularly around those who might never be enfranchised or have legitimacy. I'm not going to talk too much about this because I'm concerned. I'm actually doing all right. Surprise, my shock. It says 7:48 on my clock. Pace is all right, you just have to nod. Okay, thank you. Another movement within education, a feminist post-structural or psychoanalytical model, and some may be familiar with this or know more than I do actually, but this movement was inherited in part by earlier radical approaches, a kind of movement from the radical critique of language, which came from radical feminism and the Enlightenment, the idea that Western notions of equality, gender equality in particular, the idea that there is just two categories, male and female. We know this is a kind of binary that hides and masks other notions or narratives of gender. Critique the language of gender development, yet focused often on a kind of idea that what we were was unconsciously subservient, that was our desire, we needed to get past that. I like to think I am. Discourses of gender in school, gender binaries, etc., kind of trying to showcase how gender regimes in schools functioned. So the ideal girl, the ideal boy, subject-centered notions of gender, masculinized subjects, feminized subjects, the idea that domestic science might have been, and that would have been my history. My mother finished a degree in what was called domestic science in 1935. So challenging those notions and moving beyond them to say there are many masculinities, many femininities, opening up the categories of gender and sexuality. We're moving on to something that's, I'm not going to be talking about the post-human notion, but these critiques, when they began to look at the various feminisms operating in and through education, said, there's still pieces missing. We are not all white women in suffering. There's a vast world order, and that vast world order needs to be attended to. So the notion of a transnational or kind of post-colonial way of thinking about these categories within education in terms of a more ethical sense of a universal humanity around gender equity in education. So here we see something that moves beyond the notion of freedom and rights. It's very important that we grasp that there's another political narrative within education feminism and feminism more broadly that says we need demands for recognition, redistribution of wealth, freedoms. And here I'm going to give you an example of some of the current work I'm doing in South Africa. Take something like ANC politics and the idea of a non-racial society and the idea of political transformation on a wide scale. Right, so we'll talk about that in a minute. So when we're thinking about, oh, now I know what that means. Actually, it says 4:25 now. So it means, actually, that's what I have left. I truly understand the clock now. So, wow. So what does it mean to get beyond rights and freedoms? It's important. They're a necessary condition. But there's also an element of this, and it's a very provocative one for us to encounter and think about, really think hard about, which is how do we recognize that who we deem the other or the stranger even within a collective that has an immense ethical, integral history, like the feminist struggle, suffrage, in a currently globalizing and what might be seen as a borderless world. In other words, we are moving away from the idea that somehow, take the EU as a case, that we are bounded by strict territorial borders. It's changing the face of how our social lives are lived, both within education, our access to it. So this idea is about the transnational recognition of women and gender issues which move beyond an obsession with the West. In other words, moves beyond that language just of equality, even though it's crucial. The idea that we have knowledge from other parts of the world about gender, such as critiques that go on in the development world of education, like the girl child. That's a very common contemporary term. We see a kind of critique of this binary from a post-colonial perspective, one that acknowledges regions, geopolitical regions, differences among women in different places and other gendered subjects, and the recognition of the global domination of capitalism in undermining women's interests and other sexualized and minoritized subjects worldwide. All right, I'm just going to give you an example here of the ways in which one might recast or think transnationally about suffrage. These are women who are members of the ANC and who are talking about their access to urban life. So anyone who knows about South Africa knows that in 1950, the national government passed legislation legally sanctioned the exclusion of minorities from the center of the city, but particularly black South Africans. They had to have passes to get into the city. Many of the women worked in the city. If they lost their passes, they could not get in. So here we're not just talking about equal access, we're talking about a whole public realm that's excluded a community of people because of where they were born and how their bodies are marked by race. So in these communities, what we do see actually is remnants of an earlier time of the socialist realm, where they're recasting gendered narratives of power and education around community, around collectivities, not always around equality. They see themselves very much as comrades to each other, even now. And some of the language, which is worrying, but was so relevant to them, was that liberation had to come before education. So they often see themselves now in the contemporary moment, despite the fall of apartheid, as lost peoples of a liberation. The forgotten soldiers and activists that brought the apartheid down, but for which no nation state wishes to recognize these women. So here we will finish with my 36 seconds. Wow, I've never done this before my whole life. The struggle is not over. We must recognize, and it's being discussed within international movements, neoliberal complacence and the adversarial politics of tolerance. Is tolerance what we're talking about, or is that like saying we tolerate horseflies on the top of a mountain, as one black woman in South Africa shared with me? We need to recognize who the exiled non-citizen is. Who is the stateless, gendered subject for which we bear responsibility, both for whom in past time we may have never known, but for now we may never meet. The female refugee, the forced who are displaced, people experiencing protracted bordering and marginalization because of migration. Global conflict must be addressed in the context of both its uses and its abuses. Not all development projects are particularly good for gendered, marginalized subjects. Sometimes it means they're forced to migrate elsewhere. And the South African case was my example of a group that is thinking about that politics differently. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jo.